Welcome to this podcast for Ahval. My name's John Lubbock and I write about British and Turkish politics for a number of websites, including Ahval, who've asked me today to interview Ryan Gingeras. Ryan is the author of the book Heroin, Organised Crime and the Making of Modern Turkey, a book that looks at the historical connection between the Turkish state and organised criminal gangs. Recently, one of Turkey's most famous mafia bosses, Alaattin Çakıcı, was released from prison as part of an amnesty to ease prison overcrowding, which could contribute to the spread of coronavirus. Çakıcı was described by Middle East Eye as a former intelligence services hitman. Considering that most political prisoners have not been released during this recent prison amnesty, it's interesting that such a well-known mafia boss has been released. The concept of the deep state is one that's gained currency in Turkey long before it spread to the conspiratorial imaginations of certain Western politicians. And so perhaps we can ask Ryan how this concept came to be developed and where the current release of Alaattin Çakıcı fits into it. So Ryan, what is the deep state, and how much of the concept describes something that's real, and how much is a bit more mythological?
Hey, first of all, thanks very much for inviting me to talk, John. I think in terms of its origins are a little bit obscure, but it essentially comes into parlance in 1996, after 1996, with relationship to the Siziluk scandal, which, as anybody who sort of really follows Turkey would know, is this scandal that unearthed, linkages between elements of the Turkish security service, organized crime, and the broader Turkish war against Kurdish separatism, against leftists, and the like. Now, the term itself, has obviously, as you referred to, has taken a life of its own in lots of different places. In the case of Turkey, one of the things that makes it difficult to talk about it is because it's used to refer to lots of different things. There's not really a kind of general scholarly consensus of what it means or what it meant even before it kind of became a part of the rhetoric of the American right and sort of the world at large, really.
What kind of things do Turkish people usually mean when they refer to the deep state then?
If there's sort of a core element to it, it's the idea that there's a formal government, that has, which is, an elected assembly, there's a prime minister, there are generals who are supposed to take orders and sort of to be, and police agencies and security services that are supposed to follow the letter of the law. And then there is this other thing, this, deep state that operates in secret, does things that are patently illegal and usually violent. And the cast of characters who kind of make up this is sort of where where people's definitions may vary, or what, sort of is most paramount in the deep state may vary. So, principally it's the security service, whether it's sort of, groups acting illegally or kind of extrajudicial groups created by the security services to do things that would be illegal and, usually quite violent. But there's a broader cosmology usually that's associated with it. And so you have gangsters and businessmen, even sort of athletes, intellectuals. Depending on how rich you want to make this deep state in terms of it, occupying a whole parallel universe, you can amend a lot of different groups on it. And Alaattin Çakıcı, as you refer to, is sort of one of these people who post 1996, is seen as a kind of archetype deep state character and has long kind of been, a real subject of people's interest and imagination regarding politics, popular culture, and things like that.
When I was reading some reviews of your book and one of the academic articles you also wrote specifically about the involvement of Laz organised criminals and how the Laz gangs became quite prominent within Turkish organised crime.
Right.
I noticed that the use of these organised gangs obviously goes back to the Ottoman Empire, but was specifically became very prominent during the formation of the Republic and also the First World War, when perhaps the state's resources were being quite stretched, and also, arguably the state was engaging in, quite on the surface, stuff that they would not want other countries to know about, including the forced ethnic cleansing of many groups of people within Turkey. And it seems to me like they certainly deputized some groups of people, militias that were already existing perhaps, in order to do some of that work for them when the state had broken down to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you're talking about someone like Alaattin Çakıcı and trying to place him in the history of Turkey, I mean, you can do it in a couple of ways, and you sort of refer to a lot of them. And I think, in terms of his background, I have to say, I've never really sort of read or seen anything where he's kind of articulated the sort of background of his parents. I mean, perhaps it exists, perhaps, such interviews exist or such testimony exists. But I mean, he fits a certain, element within the making of modern Turkey, or sort of reflects a certain element in the making of modern Turkey in the late Ottoman Empire. And that, Turkey is a nation of migrants, and, migrants from abroad, as well as migrants from different parts of the country that have come and settled in the major cities in really large numbers. And people from the Black Sea region, the Northeast, have lived in sort of the environs of Istanbul and, other major cities for a really, really long time. And, in the case of people from the Northeast, they've been long associated with lots of different industries that eventually kind of become strongly associated with crime. Ironically, Alaattin Çakıcı and his entree into crime is somewhat different than sort of many of the other sort of historical characters that have associated with the making of organized crime in Turkey and their own personal backgrounds as people from the Northeast. He fancied himself, and he is celebrated to some extent, that he's celebrated as this sort of archetypal kabadaya being this kind of neighborhood boss who, for a price would negotiate settlements between feuding parties, was, sort of an extortionist, sort of a big man, big physically, big personality-wise, of a neighborhood or a town, and, who's kind of had, violent proclivities. And this is, this is the thing that ultimately made him famous, is this reputation that he had garnered, coupled with this sort of how he, became associated with politics. And, his relevance in politics, does represent this other strain that you reference, with respect to the making of Turkey and, the Ottoman Empire, which is sort of broadly speaking kind of paramilitarism as a phenomenon. The sort of the regularity with which you see, the government, whether it's the Ottoman government or the Turkish government, employ or rely upon, groups of, illicit groups of people, gangs, mafias, whatever you want to call them, paramilitary groups, to be, tools of certain policy, partners in certain policy, or sort of the where kind of the, politics and crime begin and end blur with these groups at various times and in various places. And, Alaattin Çakıcı, clearly becomes a part of this phenomenon as far back as the early 80s. He was involved in radical right politics, that he was involved in, in violence, alongside others who fancied themselves as idealists or nationalists, these ülkücü groups, or, as they're referred to. And, I'm not sure if necessarily Çakıcı got into the business of violence and politics with an eye towards the past, but he certainly is kind of, can be drawn in connection to this past.
So in terms of the early 80s, obviously, you had the military coup in 81, 82, and then you
80.
80. and then you had this period in which certain types of politics were being repressed following the coup. The government especially cracked down on Islamist parties. Erbakan was arrested and put in jail, I think. But did you also have some kind of settling of scores from the kind of the left-right factionalism of the 70s as well?
Yeah, I mean, he's, he stands accused of being involved in murders from the 1970s. Although I can't say necessarily that, he's, we really have a strong idea of how he's involved, or, I can't say that there's ever been really a forensic study of his participation in violence. And frankly, this is a common problem with trying to understand the history of violence and the history of crime in Turkey, is the nature of the judicial system, the nature of policing in the country. We don't have, a really strong history of prosecutions in the country where we can have absolute confidence in testimony. A lot of, policing is politically motivated. Prosecutions are historically, in matters of politics, politically motivated. So some people are arrested, some people get away, and some people have their crimes are never. It's not only they're not investigated, but even evidence of them are never unearthed. And so, with respect to him, I can speak authoritatively about the nature of his activities, or even speak with great confidence that he had participation in these kinds of crimes, but. Sort of like so many things in Turkey, it's based on innuendo, right? I mean, sort of the repeating of, certain, stats or, sort of accusations that, kind of go on, have this zombie-like existence, but are never really fully, investigated. I mean, so in the case of Çakıcı, he stands accused of having been involved in at least 41 different killings, but he's never actually stood. For many of them, they've never really been. He's never been tried for. Evidence of it has never been presented, and even at that, that evidence, what evidence exists, oftentimes it's difficult to cross-reference or really examine.
But these would be specifically political killings of
Yeah.
leftists, rather than rival organized criminal gang leaders or anything like that.
Yes, I believe so. He's also sort of associated with gangland killings. He's admitted, or he's been accused or sort of referenced as a hitman for the government during the 80s and 90s. Again, the nature of which of his activities are somewhat unclear, although it seems that based on at least some testimony and some evidence, that it's plausible that he had some sort of role to play within extrajudicial killings, or sort of connection to the government's efforts at suppressing Kurds and leftists violently during this period of time.
You seem to get these kind of cases where maybe the police or somebody with some political power didn't like what somebody was saying, if they're a journalist, for example, and they've got connections to organized crime, and whether or not they specifically contract it, somebody within an organized crime gets the message that X person wants this person out of the way. Is it perhaps a bit more of a less formal relationship between the state or politicians or elements of the police or military, or is it a much more formal relationship that it has existed or still might exist between organized criminal gangs and MIT, the security services, for example?
Yeah, a more appropriate analogy is somebody like Musa Anter, who was murdered during the course of this period of time. Musa Anter, having been an intellectual, journalist, somebody who's really associated quite strongly with the early iterations of the Kurdish national movement in the post-war era. He's murdered in mysterious circumstances, and his murder, unlike Hrant Dink's, is much more strongly associated with, or sort of, been with organized crime, or at least individuals who have been with ties to organized crime have been, are linked to his murder. Which, again, as, if we're going to sort of look at it somewhat dispassionately, like so much of what is now talked about in Turkey, it's based on innuendo. That his Hrant's murder has never been apprehended. He's supposedly still living and hiding. He's supposedly still alive. And, he kind of exists as a kind of part of Turkey's greater mythos of conspiracy and, subterfuge and, this kind of Turkey as secret history. And I think that that's why Alaattin Çakıcı is such a powerful figure in people's consciousness, is that he embodies this notion that Turkey doesn't have a real history. It has a secret history. It's this history that, is never documented, or is this kind of told in whispers. And, it's got, the real history conflicts violently with, what people learn or sort of is acknowledged, because it's, so violent and so, off the wall and, so terrible. And, personally, as somebody who's tried to write about, organized crime, you can only sort of say so much about so many things, and be really kind of confident with those conclusions.
I find the kind of conspiratorial nature of some of the Turkish history to be equally fascinating and problematic from a historical or journalistic point of view, because if you want to find out hard facts, a lot of the time it's quite difficult. But there's a lot of rumor and conspiracy that you can find out, which is fascinating, but you have no idea of being sure whether it's true. And when you talk to a lot of people, there's a lot of rumors that swirl around, but how much credence do you give to any of them? It's very difficult to know.
I mean, frankly, having attempted to write a book about the history of organized crime in the country, much of it is based on not, anything I gleaned in Turkey, but from the United States. And, the narrative that you find in the archives of, the predecessor to the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, is a story of organized crime, which appears nowhere in Turkish print, in print media, in books, in memoirs. It just doesn't exist. What I find really, what I've taken from that is that, there is some validity to the idea of Turkey having a secret history. The fact is, it's not actually so secret. It's just that, there are choices that historians and journalists make with respect to the kinds of stories they want to tell or can tell, they can tell or want to tell. And that it's not a matter that the truth is kept, is somehow, hidden and can't be revealed because it's too terrible, but it's the fact that, in Turkey, there are, somewhat great risks, with respect to speech, all kinds of speech, just simply things like libel law, as well as, kind of historical taboos that, that people don't want to entertain. People don't want to entertain, lots of people just simply won't entertain things like, genocide in Turkish history. They don't want to entertain the history of, kind of people in Turkey who are not Turkish defining the makeup of Turkish, politics. I'm not talking about necessarily Armenians or Greeks. I'm talking about people who are not ethnically Turkish, but are Muslim and, Turkish citizens. So, and people have trouble sort of, with those narratives. They have trouble with those stories and telling those stories. So I think that's among the things that kind of keep it somewhat obscure.
So I think this is why the relationship between the AKP and what you might call the deep state is quite an interesting one to consider, because obviously when Erdogan became prime minister in 2002, he 2002 one.
Yeah, I think he becomes prime minister in 2002. Anyway, you're fine. I'm terrible with dates too. Don't worry.
Obviously at that point, there was still, if you wanted to describe the Kemalist secularist military backbone of the state as a kind of deep state, obviously that still did exist to a great extent at that time, and but obviously it was in remission to some extent after the postmodern coup of '97, where they tried to do a coup that was sort of a bit half-hearted, and then in 2003 obviously you had the situation in which the United States asked Turkey to participate in the Iraq War, and as far as I remember reading, that the military didn't really want to make a decision about it, so they asked the civilian administration what to do, and Erdogan said, no, we're not participating. And I have heard people say that it was that decision by the military to offload the responsibility to the civilian government that kind of, if you don't use your power, you don't have it. And I don't know exactly how that led directly onto the Ergenekon trials, which were again supposedly of a kind of ultra-nationalist deep state organization, which was responsible for all kinds of things in Turkish society. But the other way to look at the Ergenekon trials is, I suppose, that the civilian administration of the AKP was using them as a way to get rid of certain inconvenient critics and opponents. But obviously now we have a situation where the AKP is in government with the MHP, the main nationalist party, who have a long-standing link to the Grey Wolves organization. I've heard the Grey Wolves described as almost a youth wing of the MHP. So having this long-standing connection of the deep state, the Grey Wolves, and MIT, and obviously certain politicians having very clear links, or having admitted to have been members of the Grey Wolves. I think, well, obviously Devlet Bahçeli, the leader of the MHP, but also Melih Gökçek, I think was a Grey Wolf member, and I'm sure that there are other people in the AKP who were. I mean, I think even I'm not that he was a member of the Grey Wolves, but there are even certain CHP politicians who had been members of the MHP at some point. So could you give an impression about to what extent is the AKP's attitude towards the deep state changing after having been sort of almost forced to get into government with the MHP? Because obviously prior to that, the AKP was seen as being a bit more friendly to ethnic minorities, and especially to Kurds in Turkey, and had a lot of MPs in the Kurdish region. So has the AKP just sort of reverted back to this kind of traditional nationalist Turkish state form that is very enduring in Turkey?
I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm not sure if the term deep state is one that can be applied anymore to the case of Turkey. I mean, I just don't think so. I mean, I can't speak confidently about it, but I don't think it. I think that the reason why people, let me put it this way, the reason why people coined the term deep state to begin with is the belief that the governing civilian powers that be, these political parties, didn't exercise full control over all levers of government, and that it was compromised from both within and from without by these different factions, whether it's the military, it's an intelligence service, it's the mafia, or whatever, right? You can't say that about Turkey today. I mean, Turkey is a country in which the governing party, the party of the president, is fully in control of the state, and has compromised into institutions that were historically relatively independent of civilian control, and that would include the military. So, I mean, what is AKP's relationship with the deep state? Well, I mean, how it depends how you want to answer that question. I mean, I think to some ways it destroyed it. You could say it destroyed it. You could say it became it. You could say it is, it blew away the mythology of the deep state, because I mean, essentially, if you believe the narrative presented to us by the Turkish court system since 2015 is that the whole the development of this idea of there being these parallel networks of paramilitaries and intelligence, gathering groups and all that, that was all a Gulenist conspiracy, right? And so, the notion that we thought, that Turkey was being, undermined from within by the deep state was actually false, and that there was actually this other deep state called, the Jamaat, called, the Gulenists, right? And now that's gone. And so, it's there. We're kind of, sort of debating which mythos do you prefer, which mythology do you prefer to explain Turkish politics? And
does the Turkish government need a deep state? Could you say that maybe?
Well, that's sort of what I'm driving at. Is that what began as a kind of offhanded way to describe something that is based in some reality. You had a civilian government. You had institutions that were seemingly compromised from within, or that operated in tandem with groups that, or in individuals that behave, that did illegal things, and that this was a kind of an institutional part of the government, even though it's not acknowledged. That's the reason why people coined the term in the first place. Now we've kind of journeyed into this entirely other dimension of political realities. And yet we still are kind of left with this question of, well, who's really in charge? And again, just, from the outside looking in, we know who's in charge. It's Erdogan, and it's the AKP, and it's, the degree to which, Erdogan, his party, his family, his loyalists have kind of grafted itself onto government, right? And that's not necessarily, I don't think there's anything secret about that. And I don't necessarily even, would say that there's something that that is conspiratorial about that. It's sort of for everybody to sort of see. And, sort of, if you're going to ask the question, well, where does Alaattin Çakıcı fit into this? I don't know. And I don't think he actually may even have a place in it, other than the fact that it may be a tokenistic way to appease, people on the far right in Turkey. It may be a kind of tokenistic way to, kind of provide a media moment for the government. Because Alaattin Çakıcı is a celebrity. In the most fundamental of terms. He is somebody who gets great, who delivers great copy for the Turkish press, for Turkish television. And, his kind of melodrama around him is sort of a made for TV, made for the media kind of event.
But you wouldn't have thought that, doing this kind of favor for, very far right figure who, is accused of all of these murders, as well as of contracting the assassination of his own wife at some point.
Right.
You wouldn't have thought that, maybe it's a gesture, of loyalty to the MHP, and for the MHP, it's a long-standing, a long-standing loyalist who's getting a favor after being loyal and doing whatever for them for a while. But you wouldn't have thought that it would play particularly well with, the average, conservative, religious, Central Anatolian core vote of the AKP, for them to be releasing a guy who is a thug who, has been accused of lots of murders.
Sure. But look, there are elements of the story that, I don't have a lot of confidence that I really know what's going on. How much of it is personal? How much of it is political? How much of it is institutional, right? I don't know. What I do know is that, I think if you're going to use this as some sort of window into the relationship between, the Turkish far right, and Erdogan and the nature of Turkish politics, you could invest, some significance in it and say, like, it's a way of trying to sort of make sure the relationship stays on the straight and narrow. But I, would say that, it's become relatively clear, despite kind of a little bit of bickering on the side, that MHP and AKP are codependent. Neither can really stay in power without the other. And ideologically, the AKP has kind of pilfered a lot of what the MHP has. AKP has pilfered a lot of what the MHP stands for, and vice versa to some extent too. So, is this a window into sort of the nature of the relationship? Perhaps. But I mean, it also may be that, like, he got, Çakıcı got a celebrity pass. He's an old man, really poor health, who has been at the forefront of American, Freudian slip, Turkish politics for, 20, 25 years, and, so they gave him they gave him a mulligan and let him kind of get on with his life. And, that's that.
I mean, I could almost see something similar happening in America, in like 20, 30 years time, where you've got, I don't know, like President Barron Trump giving a pardon to, like, some guy who helped Donald build a casino in like Liberty City or somewhere. But
well, I mean, to be fair, I mean, if you're going to compare, let's say US and Turkey, I mean, the United States possesses lots of examples like this, where, kind of you have figures who are politically significant with organized crime ties. You have gangsters who have significant political ties.
I tried to watch The Irishman, but I didn't get more than halfway through it, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a tough sit.
Jimmy Hoffa's son is still a union leader in the US, though. So.
Oh yeah, exactly, and yeah, we could turn this into a very different podcast really quickly. But I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on it, but I don't really want to share them. I think that, look, I mean, I think if you're just going to question this move because here you had a person with a really violent past who gets a really easy pass, from the Turkish judicial system, you could be that story. You could trying to draw it as a story, as a representation of the Turkish state's relationship with organized crime. It works a little bit, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, we don't know what Sedat Peker, what Sedat Peker and Alaattin Çakıcı and all these other sorts of late great gangsters really do with themselves anymore. I mean, I don't think they're doing much gangstering. They don't seem to be in terribly great health.
It mostly seems like they're doing, what a lot of other people in Turkish society do, which is to insult their opponents on Twitter. I mean,
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I mean, is that he's more of a media, phenomenon. I mean, like, these are more, these individuals, and there are only a handful left, left. Most of them have passed on. Most of these sort of luminaries of the underworld from the, the 80s and the 90s, are not the story anymore of what organized crime is anymore in Turkey. They're sort of ghosts of the past rather than representations of the present.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps we can just end on. I mean, obviously, you're absolutely right that there's a lot of things that we just can't say about these people and what the current situation is, because we're not privy to this information. I think in the more kind of long-term theoretical sense of what this says about the AKP or how the Turkish government is changing, I think, to me, the interesting thing is that the coalition that the AKP put together to win so strongly at the start of the century included, the way that I think of Erdogan sometimes is that he did a very similar thing that Ataturk did in creating this sort of national union that was based around, in Ataturk's concept, the concept of Turkishness. Ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene, right? So if you, even though a lot of the people in Turkey at that point were not strictly Turkish ethnically, but what Erdogan did, to my mind, was to replace that concept of creating this coalition around an ethnic identity with one that was created around religious identity, specifically, being a Sunni Islamic identity, because and that allowed the AKP to create this coalition that included a lot of people in the Kurdish region, and arguably the AKP. I particularly want to praise them too much, but I think it's right to some extent to say that some things for Kurdish people did get a bit better during the early part of the AKP's regime. So it just strikes me as really interesting that the AKP has, whether through choice or being forced to, has completely ditched this coalition where they were in any way trying to reach out to Kurdish people to create some kind of solution to the Kurdish question, and they have just completely reverted to this kind of nationalistic thing of we'll never give up any land, we'll never give up any autonomy, we'll replace all of your locally elected officials, and let's abandon this thing that we're the party of all Sunnis, no matter what ethnic group you're in now. Let's just go back to this this kind of nationalistic identity which is based on ethnicity, which it seems like a big change for the AKP to me, and maybe not one that they necessarily would have chosen, but perhaps were forced into by political circumstances.
Yeah, if you're going to use this as a bellwether for where Turkish kind of the nature of policy and kind of communal, or sort of communal identity, national identity, its relationship to parties, all that kind of stuff. I think at the very least, yeah, it obviously shows that over time, Erdogan made a choice, and that, there are lots of reasons why he made that choice. One could also pose that that the period that you're referring to, in which we seem to have had a much more, a kinder, friendlier AKP on matters of ethnicity or identity, or, or just simply sort of a more open embrace of civil society. Whether Erdogan actually believed in that or not is now, I think, open to debate. There's certainly lots of people out there with really strong opinions, and have had long held really strong opinions about Erdogan and his question of the question of sincerity. Did he really believe in creating a much more, kind of socially liberal Turkey, or a place where civil society would be given greater sort of freedom to play a role in the making of politics, as opposed to this very top-down, sort of state-centered, tilt within politics. Again, I wouldn't sort of. I could talk for a long time about why I think he shifted about this, but I think, like it or not, this is the choice he made, and so far, it's delivered for him the thing that he has wanted most, which is to stay in power. And and I think that is his true north, is that he has made decisions that he believes are the most kind of reasonable with respect to being able to retain power. And
I think that's in a way it's quite a traditional conservative ideology of power. When I look at conservative movements in lots of other countries, especially with the kind of economic necessities that are being thrown up by the coronavirus outbreak at the moment, that you've got conservative governments who are doing stuff that is economically really not very conservative at all. And it occurs to me that in general, conservative politicians in whatever country, their main goal is to retain power. Conservatism is an ideology of power, rather than it being tied to any particularly coherent program of economic or social activities. Conservatives will change to whatever they think is the configuration that's going to lead to having a majority in the parliament.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think, I mean, when we finally write the obituary of the AKP period, I mean, if it was up to me, I would say that the confection around AKP policy does change, but there are certain consistencies, and I think, you referred to it as a conservative movement. That's true. And I think that in some ways you could view the sort of early sort of signaling about matters of, identity, kind of a much more open, or at least more relaxed politics or attitude towards identity under AKP stewardship, as a kind of end run around the question of sort of actually really sort of taking on this question seriously. And the way he did it was by saying, look, we're a nation of Muslims, but the conceit of that is that it still is sort of very top-down, state-centered dictum that provides the basis of this new understanding. It's Erdogan who sets the table on what, in the AKP, which sets the table on what identity politics should be, not the other way around, not society, be playing a role in hashing out questions of belonging, citizenship, all that, kind of diversity, all that kind of stuff, and so I don't, and even with respect to economics, I mean, I think there's always been a little bit of kind of continuity in spite of these sorts of big shifts that I think we see it, and the ways in which Turkey is being managed from the economic standpoint. So I don't know. I mean, I think the current crisis, I think is not necessarily being addressed through a playbook per se. I think everybody's just trying to get through the week. I think just like everybody else, it's just trying to get through the week. And we'll see, it's kind of what comes of it ideologically or institutionally hereafter. But yeah.
Perhaps we'll have another incident that will lead to the laying bare of certain, certain deep state connections, as happened in the 90s. I mean, in a country where it's very hard to get this kind of information, perhaps, as journalists or historians, we're kind of waiting for some kind of accidental incident that lays bare what these connections are, so that we can write about them.
I wouldn't hold my breath. I mean, I think, this, like sort of the 2016 coup attempt, I mean, how would you know the truth at this point? I mean, how would you be able to sort of discern truth, given how, how much, has been just kind of vomited into the public space about the nature of the coup, who was involved, who benefited, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if we would necessarily know the truth if it would smack us in the face.
Well, I mean, perhaps that's part of the point. I mean, when you look at also, to look at the Russian example, where you've got advisors to Putin who explicitly state that it's their goal to confuse the public in terms of what's real and what's not. It's not hard to see that some of that kind of political playbook is being used by other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, the sort of in conversation, we could talk about it as a kind of topic of conversation if you're going to try to sort of deal with it, as a kind of issue of scholarly research. I think we'd always, it doesn't matter, what the incident is. Incidents like, so as profound as something as like a coup or an attempted coup, is always sort of fraught with questions of what can be verified. Look, I mean, it's, John F. Kennedy was killed, decades ago. We know a lot about it. and still, I mean, there are aspects of it that seem really clear, and there's the aspects of it that seem still somewhat obscure, and there's still other aspects of it that it is taken as a kind of representation of still larger questions about which people are uncertain with respect to the nature of American politics, the nature of the American state, all this kind of stuff. And so, I'm not going to sort of all pin it all on Erdogan. I mean, I think that this is the problem when you have these sorts of really dramatic ruptures.
I think that the Kennedy assassination is quite a good example, because it's within the American context, it's also something that people love to mythologize, and so I wonder if in a way that the interesting thing about Çakıcı being released is, and the reason that these people have so much celebrity in Turkey, is because Turkish people quite like that kind of mythologizing, and if the deep state didn't exist, that perhaps you would have to create it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a synergistic relationship. I mean, people, are, people have a certain affection for people like Çakıcı because, he is a living embodiment of this history that is, really daunting, but also so tantalizing. He's this proverbial person that supposedly knows where all the bodies are buried, and that kind of stuff. And so that's why, I guess people would care why we're even having this conversation, is that he's sort of that flesh and blood representation of a history that people find, really torturous, but it's so critically Turkish.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. I think we'll leave it there. But I, for one, am looking forward to enjoying the beef between Çakıcı and Sedat Peker on Twitter. Hopefully it will provide us all with lots of entertainment, even if it doesn't tell us anything of any use or consequence about the deep state. So,
John, I think you need some new hobbies, man. New hobbies. Seriously,
Well, I've got lots of time on my hands, so.
Well, yeah,
I'll go grab.
I collect Star Wars figures. That's how I compensate.
Okay. Well, I need to get some more Star Wars figures.
Yeah, you do.
Go on eBay.
Yes.
All right.
Help the economy out, man. All right. Thank you
very much, Ryan.
All right. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.